Welcome in, everyone.
Hello, everybody.
This is Everything Sucks, Let's Fix It, episode 33. My name is Ben Mayer.
My name is Anthony Buono.
Today is January 30th, 2024. Any quips?
I got nothing funny to say today.
Me neither.
So let's jump right in.
Yeah.
Okay, we got impeachment articles filed against Department of Homeland Security leader Mayorkas. This is something that the Republicans have been pushing for a long time. They basically ran the midterm elections being like, we're going to impeach Mayorkas if you give us the majority. And so far, they've been very slow to do so. It's made people on the Republican base upset, and they've held a lot of Senate, confrontations and House confrontations with Mayorkas, pushing him on the border and border security. If you don't know, Department of Homeland Security is those in charge of kind of running the border, the whole asylum process. That's all under their jurisdiction. Deportations, that's all under DHS. So that's what Mayorkas is leading. And so the Republicans have finally filed impeachment against him. So it has two general charges against Mayorkas, but the overall bubble is that he is doing a poor job handling the border crisis. And to put this in perspective, this is coming at a time when the Republicans in the House are rejecting the Senate's deal for a border legislative compromise, right? So in the Senate, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, and Lankford of Oklahoma have been working together to formulate a new immigration law that would really tighten up and restrict access from our southern border. It would put a number of caps on asylum seekers that could enter illegally, even through ports of entry, and then shut down the border if certain caps and limits are reached, right? So I think if it's, I'm not going to get these numbers right, but let's say if it's like 10,000 people cross in a day, the border gets shut down, right? So House Republicans have denied that, and now they are bringing up articles of impeachment. So there's two general charges. The first charge is the willful and systematic refusal to comply with the law. Now, this gets very into the weeds, and so I'm not going to go through every single point by point here. But the overall message here is that House Republicans are accusing Secretary Mayorkas of not following the proper Immigration and National Security Act procedures to deport illegal immigrants or restrict and hold asylum seekers for their court hearings. That is the general scheme. And this is mainly following in Section 25 B, C, and that whole section here. So the main thing they're upset about is catch and release. So the House is insisting that Secretary Mayorkas is running a catch and release scheme where those who are entered into the country, detained, then claim asylum, are then released into the United States pending their court hearing. So they aren't being held by DHS while they are waiting for their court hearing. Now, the Trump administration did not do that either. The Trump administration did not hold every asylum seeker in detainment prior to their court hearing. That's not what happened.
And no presidential administration ever has.
And the DHS does not have the resources to follow that type of restriction legally, right? They would have to break a lot of laws in terms of housing accommodation standards, sanitation standards. They just don't have the money to house the 300,000 people that have been crossing the border every month. They don't have the ability to do that. And so that's really, really important. They're also claiming that he is not following the correct protocol for expedited removal processes. So these expedited removal processes allow the United States to limit the amount of times that a detainee who is going to be deported gets to appeal their claim up to a court. So the House of Representatives under the Republican leadership wants Secretary Mayorkas and believes he should be utilizing this expedited removal proceeding much more than what he's currently doing. And so for that reason, that's another under this charge of general keeping the border open and not complying with the law. How true that is, that's going to be up to your interpretation of the law, but that's not exactly what I believe. Now, the next part here is talking about The second charge is the breach of public trust. So the first statement that they kind of go into here is that Mayorkas knowingly lied to the American public in House committee meetings, saying that the border was secure, that the border was tight, that they had everything under control. And they say, because you've lied about these things, you've obviously don't have the border under control. You can't be trusted. Because you supported statements that Border Patrol agents were whipping people when that turned out not to be true, you have to be impeached. You lied knowingly. And then they pronounce that he's failed to comply with certain subpoena requests. That's definitely something that I don't like. I don't think a secretary should not comply with subpoenas if it's done by the House. So I understand that one, I guess. Then they talk about how because he terminated construction of the border wall, that is breaking the public trust, and that's under charge. I don't understand how not continuing the policy of a former president is due for impeachment. That's a different of opinion. That's why you go to the ballot box for. That's not an impeachment question. And then they out of nowhere they say this too, which I thought this was really funny. They said that he suspended the asylum cooperative agreements with El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and other Latin American, South American countries. But it actually wasn't the DHS that suspended this. It was directly from the State Department. So this is not under the purview of the Department of Homeland Security. This came from Blinken and the rest of the State Department.
I also question the premise of that being an impeachable offense, or even part of the impeachable offenses.
Right, because it's supposed to be about high crimes and misdemeanors. So when we're getting into things like that, these sound like differences of opinion rather than overall illegal or unlawful activity, right? So they also say that like he abused his parole powers, that parole is only supposed to be granted on case-by-case bases, but instead the DHS has been paroling aliens in mass and giving parole programs and legal status to Ukrainians, Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, and other oppressed people.
I kind of take issue with that because unless it's the Biden administration as a whole that has been completely out of line in creating these parole programs. We've read and researched that they've granted access to tens of thousands of people from these places. So is that what they're saying? It's just that blatantly the parole is not allowed?
Yeah, because they when they look at the parole thing, they're looking very, very intensely on the phrase like case by case.
Yeah.
So because they're saying case by case, they really are interpreting that for individuals. Okay. Not rather like a geopolitical shock, like the invasion of Ukraine, or because of the 200% inflation rate or whatever going on in Venezuela. That's not a case by case basis.
I can't completely disagree with that.
Well, I disagree with that. I think that is case by case.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's literally, we had the case of high inflation in Venezuela, so then we.
I guess, but I think you're kind of twisting words that people who speak English know how they're used.
Well, I don't know about that. I then we'd have to see like what's the precedent of how parole was used in the past.
True.
And we do know that parole has been utilized to grant legal status.
Okay, then I have no.
But then I guess their issue is you're doing it too much.
See that? Then I have a problem with their logic.
Right.
Right. Because there's if we've settled on case by case being okay as a matter of the case of the problem in this country, the problem for these people, right? The problem, I don't know.
Earthquake in Haiti.
Yeah. Or say Holocaust of Jews, right? Is that a case that is good enough to use for all the Jews that are trying to escape the Holocaust? I would think so. Yeah. So if you're okay with case by case in that context, then I don't think you can suddenly say, oh, but Biden has to be interpreting case by case as person by person. Yeah.
So they're going through with this impeachment thing. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I think he'll probably get impeached in the House. He's obviously not going to get convicted by the Senate under no circumstances. But Mayorkas did a whole rebuttal and gave his whole argument, or at least the DHS gave their whole argument for why Mayorkas shouldn't be impeached. I recommend you go read it. Kind of outlined the points that we kind of just talked about here. There isn't too much of a difference, but
the only other thing I'd mention as far as the making of false statements in congressional hearings, like lying about how secure the border is, for example, that seems like it at least could be a reach. I haven't watched the hearings myself, but it could be a reach because I have seen so many congressional hearings where when you go in there, like at least half of the congressmen in the hearing are going to be attacking you.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to be on the defense. So it's kind of hard to be attacked with questions and then not defend the job you've been doing at all.
And also,
it seems like it would just be holding him to a higher unreasonable standard.
And let's put this in honest. Let's talk about this honestly here. He's a person who wants to keep his job.
Yeah.
Who's involved in political action.
Exactly. It's all
obviously
politics.
There's going to be spin.
Yes.
I mean, like, you can disagree. The border's secure. He could absolutely spin it and say it is secure. I don't necessarily agree with him, but I don't think that's an impeachable.
No. It makes me think of the people. Like, if you can argue that Donald Trump truly believed that he won the election in 2020, and they've used that in like certain criminal proceedings as a defense for Trump, it's hard to argue that Mayorkas is knowingly lying about how he's done his job. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So one thing that I don't have on here that I want to talk about very briefly is Trump getting his penalty for the sexual assault of E. Jean Carroll.
Okay.
That's really important. So he is on the hook now for $83 million. I think it's like 18 for damages and then like 60 something for punitive damages.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
Yeah.
It's so much money. I mean, if we look, I think his net worth is like $2.6 billion or something like that.
Okay.
That's what it says when you look it up online. I don't know how much of that is liquid, right?
No, probably very little.
Right, exactly. He's in real estate and all that. So it was probably not much of liquidity there. So this $83 million, and then in a couple weeks down the line, we're waiting to hear back from the other New York civil fraud case, which could bring down another $320 million, which would just wipe out a fifth of his net worth.
Brutal.
Just brutal.
Absolutely. And this is, so in the E. Jean Carroll case, this is for defaming.
Yes.
Her, right?
It's for defaming. Another jury has found him guilty of sexual assault.
Yes.
Period. The judge has come out very clearly and he said, as per this court, we have found that Trump did commit sexual assault against this woman.
Which, to be clear, for us, I think is completely disqualifying as far as being president.
No, we're going to elect a rapist?
Yeah.
Or a sexual assaulter?
Yeah,
what are we talking about here? Funny, there was a clip of Rudy Giuliani defending him. He's like, hold on. This wasn't rape. It was sexual assault. And it's like, dude, if that's the defense you're going with, fine by me. But please.
That's brutal. Well, because they've usually been going with the defense of just complete denial.
Yeah.
Of course.
Now you can't.
I mean, they still will. He still will.
Yes.
Right.
But he can't say her name. Every time he says her name with a denial, he's going to get charged more money.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
Like every time he brings up her name and defames her again,
Yeah.
which is him rejecting that, was defaming.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
That's fantastic. No, but it's important, I think, for us to bring up and clearly state that is disqualifying for president, because I don't think it's prominent enough in the media, and it should be like a clear red line, and it should also kind of ring alarm bells in our head that it isn't a clear red line.
Yes.
And that it's not deterring his path to the nomination whatsoever.
There is an absolutely solid group of people that are going to be voting for a confirmed rapist next November.
A convicted sexual assaulter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To put it nicely.
Okay. It's not necessarily convicted because it wasn't found in a criminal court. It was found in a civil court.
But
so it's not technically convicted.
Conviction isn't the word. What is the word?
I don't know. Found to be guilty of, committed.
Because he's not a convict.
Right. Because he's not a convict.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So, but this dude did commit sexual assault, and half the country's going to vote for him for president. Which is fucking wild to me.
Why is it civil instead of criminal?
I don't know the whole intricacies of it, but there's because it was going through a defamation case. I think that's one of the reasons, and defamation isn't a crime.
Okay, no, but rape is a crime.
Yes, but she wasn't pursuing charges for rape.
Okay, interesting. Maybe she thought she had a better chance.
Yeah, because she probably figured that the burden of proof to get a guilty without a reasonable doubt in a criminal court case for a rape that happened 20 years ago was going to be impossible.
Yeah.
So she had to go the civil route.
Good move.
Good move.
Good move.
Smart move.
Yeah.
Now, Nikki Haley has been asked questions related to this, and they're like, what do you have to say about this? And she's like, I trust the juries. The United States juries are strong and are impartial. And I'm very happy she said that.
Yeah.
I am very, very happy that we have a Republican who is saying that juries are impartial. It is so important because so many people are like, the justice system is stacked against Trump. Oh, this is a collusion. Wait a second. Are you telling me that the random people picked out of New York City that were interviewed by Trump, and he actually rejected people to be on the jury if they paid a lot of attention to the news? That was one of the questions he would ask.
Yeah.
He's like, are you very politically active? Do you pay a lot of attention to the news? Yes, I am. Yes. Okay. Get him out. Bring a new juror in.
It's crazy.
And even after all that, $83 million found by the jury.
Yeah, that's wild. It's I agree that it's really important, and it's one of Trump's campaign advisors, or maybe one of his political advisors when he was president, Stephen Miller, tweeted something about how Haley had crossed a red line. She had crossed a Rubicon with supporting the not conviction, the decision against Trump that he had committed sexual assault, and that her political career was completely over, completely dead by doing that.
What?
Yeah, so it's like, it just, I don't know, it emphasizes how much this is a one-man show. This is all about loyalty to a single person. It's not about ideals.
No. There's no policies in this politics at all.
No.
There's no policies in this politics at all. And this is coming at a time when Nikki Haley is actually doing okay in South Carolina. I know we talked about, oh man, Trump is running away with the nomination. She's only like 20 points behind. Listen,
only 20 points.
Listen. 20 points isn't that bad. Listen. 20 points isn't that bad. It's bad.
Bad is relative, people.
Bad is relative. Bad is relative when you are determining what you want to happen in November. And if you're a Democrat and you see Trump only getting like 60% of the vote in South Carolina, that should make you feel really fucking good.
True.
That should make you feel really good. Because a lot of these Haley supporters, as we know, we've dug into the crosstabs and the exit polls of New Hampshire, of Iowa. These Haley voters are not going to vote for Trump, or at least more than half of them aren't.
Yeah.
So if we see that same type of dynamic going on in South Carolina, it's going to be a whole different story.
Definitely.
Yeah. Now, South Carolina also has some weird rules where Democrats, well, not weird rules, it's the same thing as New Hampshire. Democrats can go in and vote in the South Carolina primary. And the Nikki Haley campaign is trying their best to get Democrats to vote for Nikki Haley. Chris Sununu was saying that too. Chris Sununu was trying to get Democrats to cross party lines and vote for Nikki Haley in South Carolina, so that could bump her numbers up more, which might kind of screw up with our analysis of determining how many Haley voters or Republicans would then go vote for Trump.
But some of the exit polls we saw in New Hampshire also specifically asked whether they were Republican or Democratic voters.
Yes, they were like, are you a Republican? Yes, I am Republican. Will you vote for Trump in November? No, I will not. Like 30% of people.
Yeah.
Something like that.
The one thing I'll say on this is I fully endorse Democrats in South Carolina going out to vote for Haley.
Go do it.
Please do it.
If you're a Democrat in South Carolina, go vote for Nikki Haley. I disagree with Nikki Haley. I'll vote against Nikki Haley, but please vote for her over Donald Trump.
It's actually much, like knowing that South Carolina will go red in the general.
Yeah.
You voting for Haley has much more power than any vote you could cast for Biden in the general election.
Totally true.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. We have more disturbing news coming out of the Middle East. 3 United States troops were killed and 34 were wounded on the Jordanian border with Syria. Now, let's go over why these troops are even there in the first place. So, since the destruction of the Islamic State since around 2017, the United States has had a military presence to assist Iraq in their fight to resist any resurgence of ISIS. Now, Tower 22, which is this base that was just recently attacked, is on the Jordanian border with Iraq. Jordan is a key ally to the United States in the region. So they, in combination with Jordan and Iraq, they're working together to push down the Islamic State and making sure they cannot, establish any more power in the region. It's also important to note that this Jordanian border is also, this Tower 22 base is also right on the border with Syria as well, because we also have troops in Syria, but more on the northern border of Syria. We have troops in the northern border of Syria to defend our Kurdish allies there. These Kurdish allies are also important in stopping Islamic extremists in the region. Syria hates that we have troops in northern Syria. They say that it's a full-blown imperialist occupation. That's total bullshit, but it is what it is. Again, these troops are there not because of American imperialism. Rather, we're literally there on invitation by these governments to help them.
It's to support our allies.
Yeah, this is not an example of the United States taking advantage of the Middle East or anything like that. That's not what's happening here. No, if anything, the Jordanians and the Iraqis love that the U.S. are there.
Yeah, they need our presence
yes.
To deter the uprising of these Islamic extremists.
Exactly. So, but who hit Tower 22? Was it ISIS, who United States were there supposedly to fight? No, it was not. It was members of the Islamic resistance, which is not part of ISIS. These are a Shia-based, this is a group of Shia-based militias that have backing from Iran. Now, Iran has said that Tehran was not a part of the attack, that they had no part in planning the assault on American soldiers in the region. But this is iffy.
No, we know they do.
Right.
Yeah, we're American intelligence. We've known that the Islamic resistance has ties to Iran for a very long time.
It's all about did Tehran specifically tell them to attack on this day, though, right? Like, that's when it gets more hazy.
Sure.
And that's why Iran likes playing fast and loose with these militias, because they get to pepper the United States with casualty here, casualty there, without having to actually take the responsibility for any of the blood on their own hands.
Yes, but this has crossed enough of a line that at least I think there is some sentiment in the U.S. government that we want to hold Tehran accountable.
Yes, and specifically, a lot of this is coming. Well, first, Joe Biden has said that we will be responding. Period.
Yes,
something will be happening. Now, what that means, I hope that means that we're going after these Shia militia groups more intensely. I hope that's what that means. I do not hope it means that we're going after Iran, their contiguous border.
Yeah.
I don't think bombing anything in Iran is going to help us accomplish anything or make us safer at all.
No.
And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make ourselves safer. I don't think bombing Iran makes us safer.
There is one interesting idea that I've heard floated about something we could bomb in Iran. Most of Iran's, if not all of Iran's oil exports go out of one island, which I'm forgetting the name of right now.
It's a very centralized production.
Yeah. And if we hit their processing or export infrastructure on that island, we would completely cripple their ability to export oil and natural gas, which would cripple their economy.
Of course.
It's completely integral to it.
We have to do another side here. At least I want to propose it.
Yeah.
I think that's too much of a form of collective punishment. We're not technically at war with Iran yet. We are not in a total war situation with Iran. And to do that and to cripple their economy to that extent is going to hurt the population in such a large degree that, one, it's going to get them to hate us even more.
True.
And then two, for humanitarian reasons, we can't put all those people in destitution because of something that their government chose to do.
I think that's a fair point.
You know?
I guess it's hard for me, because I think I agree with you that humanitarian wise, it's going to be a terrible thing to do to all those people. On the other hand, I think the attacks on the Jordanian or on the Shia resistance groups are kind of useless. Like, just like our attacks on the Houthis have been kind of useless. It feels like quenching a hunger from our population, from the people who read the news or who see that American troops got attacked, American troops got killed, and that we should be responding and showing our own strength and retaliation for that. But it's not going to actually further our interests. If anything, it's going to escalate conflict so that our troops are actually put at greater risk of further harm. So I don't know. Part of me feels like I'm landing between do nothing at all, because how's it really going to hurt us, versus do something that will actually affect them. So I don't know.
I mean, like, I like the strikes that we did on the Houthis for the reasons of, like, destroying munition hubs, destroying their capacity to fight.
Okay.
And so, like, we haven't eliminated the Houthi capacity to fight. We did reduce like 30% of it with our initial strikes.
Yeah.
Right. We chopped down. Now they only have 70% of their military capacity what they had.
Yeah.
You know, if we keep that going, that's something that I could see as positive.
Okay.
Obviously, like, that might not be a feasible military strategy. I'm not a military strategist, but if that's something we could do similarly with the Shia militia groups where we're hurting their munition caches.
It's possible, but remember in the conversation we had about the Houthis, we talked about how Iran is just going to reload them.
Yeah.
Right? Even if they're down 30%, that 30% is going to be built right back up.
Yeah.
And in a way, we're just fueling their economy by giving them a war. Right?
Yeah. And then it kind of brings us to the harder question of, like, how do we deal with the Iran situation? I feel like we had a okay path to peace. It wasn't perfect by any means, but the nuclear agreement with Iran and the Western world, between the European Union, America, and Iran, I think was going in the right direction by reducing the Iranian threat of getting a nuke.
Yes.
When Trump came into office, he jumped out of that accord,
which was a terrible idea.
which now put it put the Irans into a position where now they have no incentive to not build a nuke.
Exactly.
There is no incentive for them not to commit to pursuing a nuclear weapon and continue to pursue actions against the interests of the United States. There's no reason for them not to do that now.
And all of the intelligence that I've read about says that Iran is much closer to having an atomic bomb than they otherwise would have been if we had stayed in that agreement.
Yeah. So I don't know what the right answer is. I'm reluctant to say the right answer is bombing Iran, but there are Republicans in Congress who are all for that.
Yeah.
So we have one senator, Tom Cotton from Arkansas. He said the only answer to these attacks must be to devastating military retaliation against Iran's terrorist forces. Anything less will confirm Joe Biden as a coward. Now, if he says military retaliation against Iran's terrorist forces, if he's talking about the Shia militia groups, I can accept that. But
Okay.
if he's talking about the Iranian or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, which is the standard Iranian military, then I don't agree with Tom Cotton. McConnell has also criticized Biden for being too lenient on Iran in the past and is pushing him to do more. Senator Lindsey Graham is going off about how much more needs to be done.
Again, this isn't these. It all feels like political posturing.
Yeah,
Not
'cause
necessarily
what
what
is-
they're saying, but the attacks.
Well,
would
what
be.
can be done?
Exactly. What, like, nothing really can be done. The other alternative to, like, going after Iran's oil infrastructure is trying to take out their leadership that might be responsible for this. The problem is Iranian leadership is spread out over hundreds, if not thousands of people. And unless you're able to take out the entirety of their leadership at once, which is impossible, you're not going to make any substantial change to their perspectives or the actions they take.
Yeah.
So to me, like, this feels like when I hear these quotes from these senators, I think about the kind of attacks from the far right populist Republicans have on the Nikki Haley types of just being constant war hawks, right? And in this way, I seem to be in agreement with them that it's not helpful or necessary for anything.
Yeah,
like, I think diplomacy is the only right answer here.
I agree. And there's an opportunity for diplomacy that I think is coming, but we can talk about that in a second because far-right Republicans, Chip Roy, Tucker Carlson, Matt Gaetz, have all said that attacking Tehran is ridiculous. Tucker Carlson specifically said that they are fucking lunatics for suggesting to attack Iran, which I don't disagree with.
Yeah.
Attacking Iran is a crazy war right now. That would be, a decade of United States fighting.
It is literally exactly the thing we've been talking about not wanting the Israel-Gaza conflict to turn into, right? For months.
Yep.
It's ridiculous. Again, it feels like these senators are just trying to consolidate political support.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
And Democrats aren't free from it either. No. Leading Democrats in the House Intelligence Committee have supported doing something, but have not indicated what that is directly. One House Democrat said deterrence is hard, war is easy, in support of deterrence. But deterrence, and I don't understand. Like, what? If we get attacked and then don't do something, doesn't that show that our deterrence is meaningless? Because if we have all this deterrence of all these military things and then we get attacked and we don't use them, then there's no longer deterrence.
Okay, I get that. I think that's fair. So I think allowing retaliatory strikes, I think that's a good explanation for why we should retaliate against the Iran-backed militias.
Yeah.
Because even though they are backed by Iran, they tend to be more or less independent.
Yeah, they operate sort of independently.
Yes, like Iran is part of the conversations, but they also don't have total control over these like branches.
Yes.
Kind of within the region. So they will, even though Iran will continue to support these different extensions of themselves, the fact that it will actually hurt the militias themselves will hopefully emphasize that our deterrence is real.
Yes. And so then, but there's a diplomatic angle to this that I think is actually hopeful is China is now pushing back against Iran for Iran's support of the Houthis in their blockade in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, because a lot of Chinese oil comes from the Red Sea.
Yes.
And now, since a lot of Chinese exports go through the Red Sea into Europe, so now that a lot of the Chinese exports and Chinese oil supplies need to circumvent the Cape of New Hope in the south of Africa, China's pissed at Iran for letting this happen. And so China and Iran are allies. And if China can convince Iran with the United States backing to tighten the grip that they have over these loosely connected fringe radical entities throughout Iraq and Yemen, that could be really helpful.
Yeah. There have been reports coming out that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Secretary of State Antony Blinken have been having conversations, back-channel conversations with their Chinese counterparts, specifically pushing for China to try to apply more pressure to Iran to prevent this kind of disruption to trade. China has been kind of playing coy, but then this article in Reuters came out and said, hey, China is not okay with their interests being so damaged by the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea either, right? We've read articles about how it's specifically hurting China's economy and Chinese businesses.
Yeah.
So hopefully that can have an effect, but even in this article that we read, it's not clear that it will, partly because these are individual, independent groups that Iran is dealing with, right? And so the more that Iran tries to clamp down, tries to squeeze tighter as far as controlling those groups, the more likely it is that they slip out of Iran's grasp entirely.
Yes, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. So it's all very delicate, I guess I would say. Like we don't know how it's going to go. We're just going to have to wait and see.
Yeah.
Okay, so for our next current event, we are going to look at a battle for funding Ukraine in the EU. Last month, in December, the EU introduced a proposal for a 4-year, 50 billion euro aid package for Ukraine, plus 20 billion euros specifically for military aid. Now, most of the countries here are completely on board, except
which one?
One holdout, Hungary.
What a shocker.
So Hungary has been in democratic backsliding for about 15 years now, ever since their president, Viktor Orban, has come to power. And in December, Orban made Hungary the one country to veto the EU's aid proposal. His excuse was that EU money shouldn't go to countries outside the EU. And this has been a pattern for a long time, as the EU has been trying to fund Ukraine since the beginning of their war with Russia, that Orban has constantly kind of held things up, slowed down the process. And even with that, so far the EU has given over $70 billion worth of support to Ukraine. So while Orban gives the reason of not wanting to give EU money to another country, the real reason is that he's quite close with the China-Russia axis. Hungary has been wooing Chinese and Russian investment since Orban came into office. It's investing in a manufacturing economy, and a lot of the money to support that has come from China over the past decade and a half. And plus, to fuel that kind of economic development, they want cheap energy. Where to get cheap energy when you're Hungary? Russia, through oil and natural gas. So Hungary is one of a small group of countries that fought against a ban on Russian oil imports into the EU after the Ukraine war, so that they could still have that coming in. Western officials have noted Orban's close relationship with Putin, and they think he's leveraging that relationship to get concessions favorable for Hungary in other areas. So the idea is the West sees that Orban is close with Putin. They know that they kind of have to pony up to Orban and give Hungary concessions to get him to let proposals through the EU, to basically allow them to govern as a bloc. Orban has gone to the brink with the EU lots of times to extract favorable deals. And the thing is, it keeps working, right? The EU is set up so that any country can veto one of their proposals. And Orban has done that many times. And the EU has a mechanism themselves that they can kind of use to counter him, where they can withhold funding, which is important. Hungary is one of the countries that takes the most money from the EU on a per capita basis to fuel its economy. And a lot of the foreign direct investment it gets is based on these other countries knowing that it will be supported by EU funding.
And we've seen this happen also with Poland, right? So
Yep.
Poland was also on a democratic backslide with the Peace and Justice Party?
Yes.
Yeah, the Peace and Justice Party. They stacked the courts in their favor. They did all these things. They had prosecutors in parliament, which you can't do. A bunch of stuff. We had people were arrested for corruption inside of official buildings. Crazy stuff. Now, the European Union withheld like $100 billion, 100 billion euros from Poland because of all this democratic backsliding. Now the new prime minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, is working to do reforms to get that 100 billion into Poland.
Yep.
Hungary is not doing anything to get their money from the EU. They're accepting that this is their punishment for the politics they want to do.
Well, they're not only accepting it. Orban has been ramping up the vetoes.
Right.
He's been doing them more and more often to try to put more pressure back on the bloc. So it gets them in this sticky situation, and more European leaders are getting frustrated with Orban. They want to be able to pass their reforms and their proposals, and it got to the point where last week a document was leaked to the Financial Times where it was outlining a plan to damage or potentially cripple Hungary's economy if Orban tried to veto the plan again.
Wow.
So it says that the document said that heads of state would...
Wait, let me interrupt you.
Yeah, go.
So you're saying the plan referring to the Ukraine funding package?
Yes, if Orban vetoes the Ukraine funding.
Got it.
Yeah, then they'll try to go after Hungary's economy. The heads of state would declare publicly that they cannot imagine that EU funds would be given to Hungary in light of its disruptions. And this seemed to have an effect, kind of the desired effect, where Hungary's EU minister responded with more openness to an EU plan to fund Ukraine, as long as Hungary could change its mind at a later date. So the take here is, yeah, Hungary wants enough power so that they can keep going back to the negotiating table, extracting more concessions from the EU every time it wants to fund Ukraine.
Yeah.
The instant reaction that I read about from other European leaders is there's no way Orban is going to get the opportunity to veto this repeatedly year after year. So it's difficult. I think this is going to get Ukraine funding to go through. Obviously, this is also happening at a time where our version of Orban here, which is House Republicans, are preventing any Ukraine funding from coming to from the U.S., and that's also enabling Orban or any other far-right leader who comes into power in Europe to block funding coming from the EU, right? It makes it more normalized. So they're kind of completely stuck right now. But I think the European diplomats coming up with this plan to destroy Hungary's economy, even going this far as drawing up the document and leaking it, is kind of the necessary hardball that they need to play when they're dealing with a strong man like Orban.
I totally agree. You got to make these, if you are in this type of union of countries working together, you have to make sure that the countries are following the principles of your organization or cripple them out.
Yeah.
Right? Otherwise, don't be in it.
Yeah.
And Hungary needs the European Union.
Totally.
Right. Hungary needs it. The same way that Mississippi and Alabama hate the federal government, they need the federal government.
Yes.
Right. They need the federal government. They are the states that are most likely to receive money from the federal government. They need it much more than we need them. And Hungary is in that same position.
Yes. And so the EU should impose their values. I mean, we're both completely for the EU imposing their values on Hungary to condition their support on.
Yeah.
I guess the question is, does it make the alliance or the group, the bloc, seem kind of untenable? Because Orban is not the only populist leader that we have in the EU. We have Geert Wilders, who's just elected the leader of the Netherlands, who is a total Eurosceptic. We have the AfD in Germany, which we talk about all the time, which would totally love to leave the EU. There's Marine Le Pen's party in France that is kind of aligned the same way. We have Poland, which only just fell out of power because Tusk got elected. Mm-hmm. It seems hard to maintain. They want to keep power as a bloc and have it based on these fundamental values like rule of law. But if each individual country is still going to have democratically elected leaders, and democratic elections can lead to populist leaders that don't want to be part of the bloc or operate upon those fundamental values, are you just constantly have to battle those leaders that are elected in the individual countries?
Well, I think the only way to look at it is through the lens of the United States, because the United States, for all the things that we do wrong, one of the things that we've been able to do is keep ourselves together for around 250 years minus one civil war that killed 2% of our population. So besides that, we've had a fairly stable country.
Yeah.
Now, but the United States deals with this all the time. The United States always deals with rogue governors and having to impose the rule of law. Think back to the enforcement of Brown v. Board with the integration of schools. Eisenhower needed to bring I think either the 101st or 82nd Airborne Division to escort black kids to schools in protest against the governors who weren't going to let them in. Kennedy had to send people down to face down George Wallace with the University of Alabama stuff. So yes, you just have to play hardball, and the federal government can't be weak. The federal government in the EU, the federal government in the United States cannot be weak against these rejections of your group's liberal rule of law-based principles.
Yeah.
You just got to come down hard and make them feel the pain when they don't follow these rules.
Yeah, and I guess it kind of a pro and a strength and a weakness of the EU versus the U.S. is that in the U.S. we have the federal government has all of the law on its side to crack down when a governor doesn't align with them, right? The EU, not so much. It's a looser coalition.
The EU doesn't have a supremacy clause.
No.
The Constitution is supreme to all other local, state level legislation. All of it is underneath the Constitution and federal statutes and federal judgments. It's not the case in Europe.
No.
That's something that they have to change if they want a more stable system.
Yes, but I think it's a strength because it means you're not really risking civil war amongst the EU. What you're risking is something like Brexit. Right? And Brexit is probably the best advertisement that the EU has ever gotten.
Yeah, they're like, oh man, you leave, your economy will become enormously worse.
Yeah, I just listened to a podcast today that was talking about how prices in Britain and profit margins have all gone down significantly because of poorer trade conditions with the EU.
Of course.
Which is so obvious.
The biggest import and export partner, they just put up a bunch of trade barriers with them that they didn't need to be there.
Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't help anybody. The one other perspective I want to talk about on this is the weakness of this strategy from other European leaders in that Eurosceptic parties like the AfD in Germany, right? They're going to be able to look at this and they're going to be able to paint the EU as the big bad Goliath that's stepping on Hungary, the little guy, and who's threatening to just completely cripple their economy because the reasons won't matter. They won't even get to the ears of the audience. It'll just be, what the heck? The EU is trying to ruin Hungary. They're just Hungary. And I think that is going to provide them with fuel. It just goes to show how clear the communication has to be of why they're doing this, why Ukraine funding is so important, how Orban has been completely on his own in vetoing that Ukraine aid, how he is the rogue actor. It's not the EU trying to go after him.
Yes. I will say it makes it a lot harder when the thing that you're pushing, the EU is pushing down hard on Hungary for Ukraine funding. United States pushing really hard on a state front, integrating schools is a way easier a fight to have in the media.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So the EU is going to have a hard thing to sell to people. Like, no, we need to like we're threatening to crush this member state's economy for the sake of a nation that's not a member of our union. That's a hard sell.
True. And in that way, it also does help Putin. It helps Russia by showing a disunited front on the West, right? I think one of the West's biggest strengths when Russia first invaded Ukraine is that we had a clear good guy, bad guy situation, right? It made all the sense in the world to give all of the funding to Ukraine for moral, for ethical reasons, just as much as national security
and
reasons.
Geostrategic.
Exactly. But now when Hungary pushes back, suddenly it seems like it's a murkier picture. Like we don't actually know who good and bad is. If Hungary is part of the EU, but they're also friendly with Russia and they want to hold back on Ukraine aid, are we sure that Ukraine aid is necessarily such a good thing to do? And Putin and Russian media uses that. They call out and they show what Orban is doing to support themselves. So that's where, like, some people have said that it doesn't matter that Orban like protests these things publicly, protests Ukraine aid publicly, as long as he comes around in the end and does the right things as far as dropping the veto. But the truth is, this is an information war that's constantly going on.
Yeah.
And by giving this resistance to the EU, Orban is giving more ammunition in that information war to Putin.
To Putin, to the AfD, to the VDD, to in the Netherlands, to the Vox Party in Spain. All of those parties gain from Hungary doing this.
Yeah.
So let's go bring back to local politics. We got more news on the Republican federal abortion agenda. So Trump has not committed to signing a national abortion ban, but that does not mean that Republicans will not pursue other policy changes that will limit access to reproductive care. So abortion activist groups, one of which was the Students for Life, her name is Kirsten Hawkins. She talked about this. She said, due to not having 60 votes in the Senate and not having a firm pro-life majority in the House, I think administrative actions is where we're going to see the most action after 2024 if President Trump or another pro-life president is elected. So these pro-life organizations are already prepared to not work through legislation, but to rather work through changes in executive protocol to get the policies that they want implemented and get them done. So one of them is to roll back Biden-era policies that have expanded abortion access, specifically through the VA. So the VA submitted the Veterans Affairs. Yes. So like they have a whole medical system in the United States specifically for veterans. So the VA submitted an interim final rule that would enable it to provide abortions when the life or health of a veteran or beneficiary is in peril, or in the cases of rape or incest. They are already coming out and saying that we are going to get rid of that. The Veterans Affairs will not be performing abortions if your life is in danger or in the cases of rape or incest.
Holy cow.
So that's a whole other thing, because technically like the VA is funded by tax dollars, and tax dollars aren't supposed to go towards funding abortions because of the Hyde Amendment.
Okay.
But Biden changed this. So this is a recent change in U.S. policy that the VA is allowed to do this. Okay.
And now, so then the VA is saying...
No. The VA wants this. Trump is saying, and abortion activists are saying, if we get Trump back in, we'll take it away.
Okay.
So the VA would not be able to perform abortions in the cases of rape or incest, or if the life of the mother is threatened. Another one that I think is really important is what Trump will do to Title X. Now, what is Title X? Title X is a family planning program which provides free and subsidized contraception, STD screenings, prenatal care, and other services to millions of low-income people around the country. They do not directly perform abortions. They rather counsel patients about abortions because, again, Hyde Amendment, tax dollars can't go to performing abortions. In 2019, the Trump administration barred all clinics that receive federal funds from counseling patients about abortions or providing referrals to one. So all these Title X clinics, all the money that was getting money through Title X, weren't allowed to counsel patients about abortion or provide referrals. In response to this, a quarter of Title X providers left the network entirely in protest of the rules, and 22% fewer patients were served after this subsidized healthcare was no longer brought to these low-income communities through these federal funds. Trump, in response to all this, Trump gave Title X funding he gave this funding to faith-based centers that don't provide or inform patients about their full range of contraceptive options and try to dissuade them from having an abortion. So this is like, these faith-based centers are more abstinence-oriented around sexual safety rather than actual sexual safety of sexual education and contraception.
Classic,
right? Now, again, I want to emphasize Title X money does not go towards abortion. It only makes people aware of all of their options. And that's what Trump stopped in 2019, and that's what Trump will do again if he gets back into office. That's like such a bad one, dude. 22% fewer patients getting screened for STDs, getting access to the healthcare that they need.
Yeah, I mean, just restricting information that way of what you actually can do feels so like an authoritarian policy.
Yeah. Oh, you think?
Yeah.
Oh, never would have thought. Never thought the guy. Oh, also, never would have thought the guy who's been proven. He's been a proven sexual assaulter / rapist. Doesn't care about women's health issues.
Yeah.
Who would have thought? So that's not all. So he's going after Title X. He's undoing Biden's stuff around the VA and expanding VA access. Now he wants to attack the abortion pill. So Students for Life is pushing for the EPA to classify chemicals in the abortion pill, mifepristone, as forever chemicals, which will subject it to stricter regulations and require any doctor who prescribes the pill to be responsible for collecting and disposing of the aborted fetuses.
Hey, I can't. I have to give credit to their strategy,
dude.
Right?
These people should all become lawyers. These guys would be wicked lawyers.
Yeah, they are. That is creative.
Yeah, right? So then
it's wrong, but it's creative.
They want to use the FTC to prosecute virtual clinics that prescribe the pill in states where the pill is banned. So like if you're in Mississippi and the pill is banned there, and you log on to a virtual call and your doctor's in Boston and you try to get the prescription from your doctor in Boston, get it sent to Mississippi, not happening.
Yep.
That's illegal. Then Trump and a bunch of his advisors have floated the idea of bringing back enforcement of the Comstock Amendment. The Comstock Act. This bans delivery of any lewd or lascivious material, like sexually related material.
That's
devious
crazy.
Material. Now,
that's crazy.
Where does this come from? It comes from, I believe, an 1870 law. That's when the Comstock Act was passed. This was the guy, Comstock or whatever. He wanted to ban masturbation.
Oh,
like
my
this
God.
is the type of stuff that they're working with now. So the scope of this law has been drastically narrowed by Congress and the courts over the years. One example of this, it is no longer can be used to stop the mail delivery of contraception. But Republicans want to bring this back full force. They want to cut off access to the pill and medical equipment needed for abortion procedures. So they don't want any mailing stuff bringing medical equipment to these abortion clinics that use this equipment to then perform abortions. Okay, this will allow criminal prosecution to both the providers sending the drugs and the patients receiving the drugs. This is locking a person up for taking mifepristone with the Comstock Act. That is their stated plan.
That's
GOP
crazy.
state attorney generals have cited Comstock to pressure major pharmacies not to carry the pills in their states, and it's been working.
Wow.
Pharmacies are no longer carrying the pill directly because state attorneys generals have been threatening them with the Comstock Act. Again, the Comstock Act is named after a guy who wanted to ban masturbation. This is where we're at with the Republican Party. This is where we're at.
This is crazy, man.
And you know where all this came from? Project 2025.
Of course.
That's where all this info came from. Project 2025.
My goodness.
Putting it right out in the open for all of us to read. Nice and plain and simple.
Yeah.
All right?
This is just like, as far as our basic fundamental value of freedom, really seems like we're throwing that in the trash.
No, throwing it in the trash. And they're just attacking women's issues. And so we're not, I'm going to fight every tooth and nail to make sure this does not happen.
Of course.
Right? Like all of you should get out there and phone bank and knock on doors and talk to your parents and talk to your friends. Make sure they vote. Make sure they know how to vote. Make sure they know where they're going to vote. Make sure they're registered to vote. Get all that shit way prepared before the election season so we don't have to deal with this in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, but also want to point out that even just in having Roe v. Wade overturned, it means that it is giving them the runway to think more about this. It's not just that we have to prevent more from happening. It's that we have to codify Roe v. Wade. It's that we need to enshrine majorities in the House and the Senate, as well as maintain a Democratic president, so that we can completely outlaw infringements upon women's bodily autonomy and freedom to past this extent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Quick break, okay? This is going to be a new clip.
Okay.
The Senate races are getting really, really hot right now. The two main ones that are going to decide who has control of the Senate are going to be Ohio and Montana. This is Sherrod Brown and Jon Tester, both Democratic incumbents. Whoever wins these two Senate seats will control the Senate. In Ohio, it will most likely be Sherrod Brown versus Bernie Moreno. In Montana, it will most likely be Jon Tester versus something Sheehy. Now, Sheehy
Tim
is
Sheehy,
Ted
right?
Sheehy, something like that.
Tim
Sheehy.
I think it's Tim Sheehy.
Tim Sheehy is he is the establishment pick, the McConnell perfect golden boy to go and take out Jon Tester. Okay, he is in a tight, somewhat tight primary race against Matt Rosendale. Now, I want to bring your attention to these two races because if you're a Democrat and you are a little bit more of the moderate type, Sherrod Brown and Jon Tester are fantastic candidates for your line of thinking. Sherrod Brown is a true union guy. He does not focus much on the racial or gender issues. Not saying he's bad on those issues from a left-wing perspective. He most certainly isn't, but that's just not what he does. That's not his bread and butter. He's big on banking regulation. He's a big supporter of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He's massively supportive of unions. He's he's been working with J.D. Vance, who is the other senator from Ohio, on a train safety bill in response to the East Palestine train disaster last year. He's been working hard on stuff like that. So that's his game, okay? Now, in Montana, we have Jon Tester. Jon Tester has been a very strong bulwark for liberal policies, but also for keeping the Biden administration in check on some other things that are important to conservative mindsets. Jon Tester rejected the Biden administration's push for vaccine requirements. Jon Tester did not vote for vaccine requirements coming down from the federal government. He's done other things that coincide with a more conservative mindset, and he is truly a good liberal alternative to far-right craziness coming out of Montana. And so if you're interested in keeping the Senate majority in Democrat control, consider donating to Jon Tester and Sherrod Brown, Ohio, Montana.
Great ad.
Yeah. All right. So now let's get into the economic news coming out of the United States. And this is juicy.
This is sexy.
This is good. This is really good news, guys.
Yeah.
We have annual inflation over the second half of 2023 officially fell back to the Federal Reserve's 2% target.
Yeah.
Now, what do I mean by that? Because all of you, if you watch the show, you're like, wait a second, Anthony, I thought 2 weeks ago you told me that inflation numbers were still at 3 point something percent or something like that. Well, if we only take the last 6 months and then multiply that number by 2, and we annualize the last 6 months of 2023, we get our 2% number. So if the trends of the last half of 2023 continue, we will be back in the Federal Reserve 2% target, which is just awesome news that we've been able to stick this landing, guys.
Yes.
And that we have to put that in perspective of how truly amazing this is. We were in an inflationary spike up to 8%. We had two quarters of economic growth that were negative. And then we were back with massive economic growth of 3.1% over the last 12 months.
Crazy.
The best in the world. The best in the world.
Well, the best out of our our comparative countries.
The best out of our comparative countries. Obviously, smaller developing countries will have way higher rates of growth, but that's not the point. Point is, our peered countries were vastly overperforming them.
Yeah.
And economists need to go back to the drawing board and wrestle with some things. We have operated under the assumption for like 4 decades now that unemployment and inflation have an inverse relationship where the higher unemployment is, the lower inflation is. And the lower unemployment is, the higher inflation is. Well, we have a long record, and this is called the Phillips curve, okay? Now, we have a long, 2 decades of data that have totally broken that trend. From 1995 to 2013, there was absolutely no corollary effect, no correlation between cyclical unemployment and inflation. That was not the case. In the 1980s, in the 1970s, in the 60s, there was a direct relationship. Not anymore. And that tells us a lot about our maybe mastering of monetary policy. Maybe it tells us a little something that made that time period had more confounding effects that we didn't recognize at the time.
Yeah,
Some economist is going to win the Nobel Prize by proving why the Phillips curve was never a thing.
Yes, but I also want to point out that this should just ratchet up our skepticism of economists.
Yes.
Some economists will win the Nobel Prize for saying the Phillips curve isn't right, and then whatever framework they come up with will probably be proven wrong in 25 more years. Okay?
Yes.
So you're going to read tons of New York Times articles, tons of articles from all over the internet, tons of publications that will cite these well-reputed, highly paid economists that make these predictions about the economy, just like last year, where the vast majority of economists were sure that we were going to face a recession in 2023. And they're just going to be wrong.
Yeah.
So I don't want us to trust them so much as harbingers of doom or harbingers of unstoppable growth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, let's think about it this way. The United States has gone above and beyond what the Congressional Budget Office thought our GDP would be. Yeah. Not what the GDP would be this year. Not this year's projections that were made all the way back in 2017.
Wow.
We've beaten, despite COVID.
Yeah.
We've beaten those projections.
That's insane.
That's insane. And why did that happen? Well, economists, as wrong as they are, this is what they're now dealing with. They are saying that the success in reviving the economy suggests that the Biden and Keynesian approach to future downturns is proven right. They want to see more downturns that rely on government power of the purse and less on Federal Reserve control of the cost of credit.
Yep.
So what this is saying, guys, is Washington's priority of full employment over dollar stabilization was the better move.
Yes.
That's what's happening here. The federal government's decision to inject money into the economy when it was doing poorly was directly responsible to our booming economic growth rather than the loosening of credit controls. Now, why is this? Well, when you loosen credit controls, and when I say that, I mean reducing interest rates. And why does reducing interest rates, in theory, boost the economy? Well, it becomes cheaper to borrow money. That means private investors can say, oh, I want to take more money out of the bank. I want to invest it here and there. And there's less risk to them in doing so because it costs less for them to borrow that money. Mm-hmm. But Washington injecting money into an economy has much less lag reflexes. And with the monetary policy of reducing interest rates, it takes time. It takes months. You have to build confidence. You have to all these private entities have to work decentralized, not communicate with each other, and pull that money out, and invest it. It's not as efficient.
Yeah.
And so this is the direct result of demand-driven economic recovery. This is stuff that came from the American Rescue Plan and other investments of the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, those three, the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act, those effects are barely seen yet. We don't even know the effects of those bills yet. These are decades-long bills.
Yes.
This is decades amounts of money. Because American Rescue Plan was right away money. Okay, that's what That's what we felt. These three other bills, we don't even know what that's going to do to our economy in the next 5 years.
We're only seeing the very, very beginnings of it with the private investment that those kinds of bills are enabling. But those bills are all based on creating infrastructure in one way or another, right? Mm-hmm. Manufacturing for chips. Infrastructure bill means roads, bridges, railroads,
tunnels,
airports. Inflation Reduction Act is infrastructure for clean energy creation, right? EVs, EV manufacturing, charging stations. All of the rewards that we're going to reap from those kinds of policies are decades long time frames.
Yes. So if we're reaching 3.1 growth without feeling the long-term effects of these, just imagine what we're going to have when these start really pulling their weight.
Exactly.
And so what I want to bring this out is this is a real return to Keynesian economic theory. And I believe the death of neoliberalism in America.
Really?
I think this is, well, at least it's the beginning of the end. It's a shift of dramatic proportions.
I agree. Well, I'm just skeptical that this Keynesianism will hold.
Yes.
I think it at least has introduced us to a period where Keynesianism is finally put back on the level of neoliberalism.
Yes.
And can compete with it from election cycle to election cycle.
One reason that I feel like it might hold is because Biden wasn't the first president to do it. It was Trump. Trump, with the CARES Act, under the with the Democrat House and the Republican Senate, they passed the CARES Act. This did the PPP loans, where you're loaning money to businesses. It did a stimulus check. It did expanded unemployment insurance. All of that was initially done under Donald Trump. So if there's a bipartisan consensus of anti-neoliberalism in times of economic downturn, there we go.
We're safe.
We're safe.
We're through.
We're through. So
okay.
This is an analysis from one Washington Post economic advisor. They said putting money in people's hands versus moving around interest rates, which is monetary policy, fiscal policy is going to be stronger. We cannot go into the next crisis being like, oh, the Fed's got this.
I love that you quoted Claudia Sam here, who's one of the few economists that actually got it right that we weren't going to see recession in 2023.
And so there we go.
Yeah.
And now we it's nice knowing that Washington won't be bought into the mindset that, oh, the Fed's got this all taken care of. We've learned from that mistake. Yeah. That's the mistake that was made in 2008, guys. That was the mistake in 2008. Obama, when he passed his stimulus bill, it was about $800 billion for his American Rescue Plan back in 08, 09, around there, 09. Now, he had other economic advisors telling him, you got to go over $1 trillion. You got to go bigger. You have to go bigger. They're like, even if you do $1 trillion and you think that's too big for right now, you won't get another bill passed. And Obama was making the calculation like maybe 800 billion was the right number. And if it's not the right number, we can come back and do it again later. That was the mistake, because Obama passes the stimulus bill. America has a sluggish recovery. He loses the midterm election in 2010. And with Republicans in the House, they are forcing him to do cutbacks in federal spending, which only prolonged the Great Recession. And that is what I want to kind of get to, and how long it took for us to get back to our employment figures and job creation post-economic downturn. So in the 2008 recession, it took us 77 months to get us back to the amount of jobs we had prior to 2008.
6.5 years?
6.5 years to get back.
Wow.
In the 2001 recession, it took us around 50 months. In the 2020 recession, it took us 25. And that's because of a different approach to this economic downturn.
Yep.
Also, different countries around the world had different approaches, okay? So when we look to other peer countries, right? The United States is 7% larger than what it was before the pandemic. That is twice what Japan gained, and way better than Germany's 0.3% growth that we've talked about on this show.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, over the 4 years through September, the most recent comparison available, U.S. wages after inflation grew by 2.8%. That's real wage growth, 2.8%. Let's look at internationally. Italian wages sank by 9%, and German workers earned 7.2% less than they had before the pandemic. That's showing that what America has done here has been incredibly beneficial. And then here's the difference of policy. The United States spent 25.5% of gross domestic product. Germany only devoted 15.3% of GDP to the pandemic, France 9.6%, Italy 10.9%, and Britain 19%. These countries didn't go big enough at the time when it mattered in order to bounce their economies back. There's other confounding variables like, prices of energy because of Russia's war in Ukraine. There were other things going on. But because they didn't go down this path, they made themselves that much more vulnerable to these other international shocks.
I do want to quickly point out, too, that this really emphasizes the point that inflation is so very much not just a function of government spending, of this kind of fiscal stimulus. Because the U.S. tamed inflation much faster than Germany, than France, than Britain, than all of these peer countries in Europe. Okay, so Germany, having spent only 15.3% of its GDP, Germany's still dealing with higher inflation than 5%. So everybody who's complaining, or who might listen to what we're talking about right now and complain and say that spending 25.5%, sure, it might have helped the economy, might have helped employment, but look at what it did to inflation. No, it clearly is not the problem if these countries that spent so much less are still dealing with higher inflation than we are now.
Yes, there are economists suggest that maybe 2% of inflation at most was due to the American Rescue Plan. 2% at most was because of the Inflation Reduction Act. So then what was the downside to all this debt? I don't know. We'll have to see. Right now, our GDP ratio is 120%, right? So that means our debt is 120% of what our GDP is, around there.
Is that true? Okay.
Yeah, it's around 120, 115, 118, something like that.
Okay.
All right. Now, again, we'll see what the effects of this are, but America is actually currently in the process of dampening the amount of money in circulation. We're actually decreasing our money printing right now. So we're only going to see that debt decrease over the next couple of years, especially because the Inflation Reduction Act was a deficit neutral piece of legislation.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't imagine the debt to go up anymore. This is now going to be a slide back down in terms of our debt.
Okay.
What are you seeing? What are you reading?
No? I didn't find anything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the big takeaway here is that congressional actions can affect the economy way faster than the lagged impacts of changings of borrowing costs.
Which just makes so much sense intuitively,
Yeah,
right? Like the people who are going to be affected by interest rate changes are mostly major lenders, right? And those major lenders are going to go to institutions, and there's kind of, I think about it like frictional losses within the system, right?
Yep.
Before the money, it's why trickle-down economics doesn't work, because the money, it gets dispersed higher up in the distribution where it's going to be spent less effectively for the economy, and only a portion of it gets down to the bottom of the distribution, and it gets down there much, much slower.
Yeah.
So by putting money with stimulus checks directly into the hands of everybody in the economy, you just do so much more to fuel it.
Absolutely. And so there we are, guys. America is in the best position of any other peer nation.
We're killing it.
Killing it.
Absolutely killing it. Okay. Now, I found an interesting article about a legal challenge, or a ballot challenge, actually, to Washington State's landmark Climate Act. So Brian Haywood, who is a hedge fund manager, has funded a petition drive to repeal Washington State's Climate Commitment Act, which could head to a ballot initiative in November. Now, what is the Climate Commitment Act? Essentially, it's a state-level cap-and-trade law, which is awesome.
We love cap and trade here, folks.
Cap and trade, we've talked about. It sets a cap on the amount of carbon emissions that actors in the state can emit, and these entities, these actors within the state are allowed to trade their emissions credits that they buy at auctions, so that then the state can set this level of emissions and slowly lower it down over time until it's completely reduced emissions out of the system. So this was signed into law by Washington Governor Jay Inslee in 2021. It sets a cap on carbon emissions, and it helps plan for dropping Washington State's emissions by 95% of 1990 levels by 2050. Beautiful. 95%.
Beautiful.
It's crazy. So Haywood has brought this challenge to repeal the act because of effects on gas prices, which is just hilarious. So classic. His effort would prevent the state from creating any similar cap and trade system in the future. So this is a huge political deal. They've collected thousands of signatures on this, at least maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, to get it on the ballot in November. And politically, this is a really important battle because other states are going to be looking to Washington to see the feasibility of passing this. Right now, or in December, the New York government came out with its own proposal for a state-level cap-and-trade law, and they based their plan largely on this one from Washington State. Now they're going to be looking very closely to see if it can withstand political backlash, right? Because it makes all of the intuitive sense in the world, and it is at least partly true that gas prices would be driven up by a law like this, right?
Sure.
They're literally placing a tax, more or less, on the gas, on the emissions that the gas is going to produce. So state legislators in Washington have talked about how they wish that they had come out against this more strongly, or they had come out kind of ready to defend the bill more strongly in the beginning and ready to communicate how it is helping people in the immediate term and how it's helping with their progress in the transition to renewables, in the transition to a green economy. So the truth is the law is already having super tangible benefits. First of all, it has drawn more than $2.2 billion from their system of not quite cap and trade. They call it cap and invest. So all the money they raise from selling these carbon credits goes into a fund that is then used to subsidize green energy projects. Those include helping families installing energy efficient heat pumps, incentives for garbage trucks, delivery vans, and buses to go electric. And there's one example of a company that's starting a hydrogen facility in the state that was granted $20 million from the Climate Commitment Fund and then received an additional $1 billion in federal aid because of that initial state investment that showed that they were able to get this project off the ground. Meanwhile, businesses are figuring out how to run their operations while emitting less carbon, and it's spurring just far more investment in solar and hydrogen across the board. So it's having huge effects as far as the progress that Washington is making in this transition, but we know how fickle voters can be and how much they like to pay attention to gas prices.
Gas prices is like the number one predictor of how an election is going to go.
So this is going to be a huge deal when we look at this is a state, this is a policy that's on the front lines of innovating how to actually tackle the climate crisis at a level that we need, right? I'm so hopeful. I'm going to be watching this ballot so closely to see if Washington is able to pass it, to keep it around, because if they do, then I think this puts them clearly on the path to kind of basically be net zero by 2050. We're just going to have to see if they can communicate, if they can run a powerful enough campaign to get people to understand how important this is.
Do we know which ballot this is going to be on? Do we know if it's going to be on the Washington primary ballot coming up soon? Or
November. It'll be on the
November ballot.
Yes. So they have time. Which is good.
If you're, I'm hopeful that that's good for this then, if it's in November.
Yes.
Because that means that Democrats will be running a hard campaign, which also means that they'll be saying vote yes on whatever line this ballot is on. Exactly. If it was in a primary, we don't have a very competitive Democratic primary. It would have been really hard to get people to go.
Yes.
But I'm glad it's in November.
Yes. So I do hope Democrats are going balls to the wall to organize this, right? And if you happen to see this and you live in Washington, just know how important it is for you to go to the ballot in November and to vote to keep the Climate Commitment Act, because this is going to be a huge deal, not only for Washington State, but as a signal to the entire country about what is possible that they can do at the state level to fight climate change.
Absolutely. We have more economic news coming out of China. Evergrande, the largest real estate company in China, has been sitting in limbo for around 2 years. They have $300 billion in debt, and finally, Evergrande was ordered by a judge in Hong Kong to liquidate. This move will set off a race by lawyers to try and grab anything that belongs to Evergrande that can be sold in order to pay back creditors. In response to this decision, the stock price dropped more than 20% before trading was finally halted. Now, this is happening just a week after the Chinese stock exchange dropped by 6.2 million yen. Now, So the stock is just in a total free fall. Evergrande's lawyers have attempted to stop the liquidation. They say that this will not help creditors get repaid and ask for more time to make a deal with their creditors. Well, Evergrande has been trying to make a deal with their creditors for the last 2 years. That's why they've been in limbo.
Yeah.
And they've made absolutely zero progress. This is why the judge did not go for this. So the judge is ordering Evergrande to wind up its operations, citing the company's inability to bring concrete proposal to the court for 1.5 years. This is going to be hard for Evergrande because a lot of its assets don't really have any real value.
Yeah, I've seen something that said that Evergrande is going to get like 1 to 2 cents on the dollar for its assets.
God, that's so bad.
Yeah.
And it also makes it hard because real estate is tightly intertwined with politics in China. And a lot of this is all political maneuvering now. Under an agreement signed in 2021 between Hong Kong and Beijing, a mainland Chinese court would recognize the Hong Kong's court-appointed liquidator to allow creditors to take control of Evergrande assets in mainland China. So right now, on the books, there's an agreement that Hong Kong and Beijing have agreed that a Hong Kong liquidator can come in to China proper and liquidate the firm, okay? But so far, only 5 such requests to local Chinese courts have ever been granted. Oh, I'm sorry. But so far, only 1 of the 5 requests to local Chinese courts have ever been granted. So only 20% success right there, okay?
Yeah.
What if China could just say, no, you're not liquidating Evergrande?
Yeah.
Because it's so intertwined with politics, right? And Xi doesn't want to portray the decline of the nation's economy. He doesn't want this liquidation to happen.
Yeah, this is the important takeaway here, right? We've known that Evergrande was bankrupt or that it had defaulted on its debts for years now.
Yeah.
Liquidation was almost certainly, at least partial liquidation was going to happen at some point. The interesting thing to watch now is how does China respond to an offshore creditor coming to collect, right? Because China and specifically local governments have massive amounts of debt. And a lot of those are held by offshore creditors. And if suddenly those offshore creditors start to lose trust in China, in these governments being able to pay back on those debts, it's what I imagine is something like a bank run.
Yes. It's all, now we need to see, are creditors' rights going to be respected?
Yep.
Right? China has made this turn towards capitalism and since the 1990s. They've done all this. They've opened up their markets to international money. Okay, you know what comes with that? Being responsible for that money.
Exactly.
Being responsible and responsive to international creditors. Okay? If you can't follow through on that, no one's going to want to invest in China anymore.
Yeah.
Foreign direct investment is going to plummet. And all these Chinese debt crises that we talk about are just going to become that much more prominent because no one is going to trust the Chinese government and the Chinese mainland and the Chinese economy as a worthwhile, safe place to put their money.
Yeah. And for that reason, I do think that she will, I mean, you say 1 of 5 requests to local Chinese courts have been granted. She has to know what kind of pressure is here to actually pay off these debts.
Yeah. I don't know the size of the other 5 that have been made. It's not Evergrande big.
No. I just think the government has to bail them out to some extent because this kind of foreign direct investment is so necessary to their economic.
When you say bail them out, you don't mean bail them out. You mean let the liquidation go through.
Let the liquidation go through, but also and if they need to pitch in for some of the payments, do it. Like not to save the company, but to maintain their own integrity.
Whole.
Yeah.
Make the creditors whole.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. It's going to be really hard for China. This is also a threat to Xi's centralization of power, right?
Yeah.
This is a Hong Kong court affecting Beijing economics and Beijing policy. This is a whole threat to his power a little.
Well, that's a part of it too. Like Hong Kong has kind of just become another arm of China in recent years.
Yeah.
So if they can't square things off with Hong Kong, then think about like Western creditors. Like that's a whole different story, and they're going to be probably much more hostile, much less trusting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Last bit.
No, go.
Yeah. All right. Last bit of current event news. We got the UAW, the United Auto Workers, endorsing Joe Biden. Sean Fain gave an immaculate speech endorsing Joe Biden, and I recommend all of you go watch Sean Fain's endorsement speech of Joe Biden.
Yeah.
It's less about Joe Biden than it is about the working class movement in this country, the labor movement, the union movement. And Sean Fain makes the calculation that the union movement is better off with Joe Biden in office than Donald Trump. He directly calls Trump out. He calls him a scab. He calls him out for not walking the picket line with UAW workers during the strike. He calls him out for joining he calls him out for going to another auto worker shop that was not unionized and where he was invited to go and speak by the bosses. Yep. He calls him out directly. He says that he's a billionaire that's going to look out for billionaire class interests. And I'm really happy to see that type of rhetoric work its way into politics and really national politics.
Yeah, definitely. I think it did a great job laying out specific points of why Biden is so good for the working class, why he has been, showing that he always has been on their side, and how Trump, while trying to show or say that he is, has never really backed it up with his actions.
Never once.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if it will have an effect. I'm hoping it's good for the Biden campaign. I expect ads to be made out of the clips.
Yeah.
So
I mean, listen, the UAW has always endorsed the Democrat candidate pretty much. I don't think they've ever endorsed a Republican candidate as far as I'm aware. But the point is, Sean Fain withheld the endorsement for a longer period of time. He really made Joe Biden earn it. And that's what I really like to see coming out of the union and UAW movement is I want to see the unions hold politicians' feet to the fire.
Sure.
It's not the job of a union to just, let the politicians get off scot-free. It's their job to keep them really fucking accountable.
Yeah.
And that's what he did to Joe Biden. And that's what he did. He made Joe Biden walk the picket line. He made Joe Biden nominate good people to the NLRB. And because of that, we have great decisions like Chemex, which increase union checks, check cards and stuff like that, make it easier for people to join unions, fight back against unions who are interfering in elections. And all that is because, labor unions push Joe Biden on this issue.
Totally. Yeah. It's been great.
All right. You ready?
Deep dive?
Deep dive time.
So Anthony did nothing for this deep
Why
dive.
would you out me like that?
Because I want to set this up as you're listening, and I want you to challenge anything that you are skeptical about.
I'm going to react to what you tell me.
Exactly. Anything that you're missing understanding on. So I should probably tell you guys what this deep dive is on. It's kind of merging with a current event where last week, the Biden administration announced that it is going to pause its approval of exports of liquefied natural gas from new terminals that are being set up in the U.S. So I think the nuances there are important, and we're going to get into them more. But I figured it would be an interesting opportunity for us to look into general ideas for policy that restricts fossil fuel-based fuel sources and how that helps in the fight against climate change. Because that's a big reason why Biden is doing it. It's a big reason of why he announced that he was doing it. It's to treat the climate crisis like the crisis that it actually is. So I want to start with the general premise, and then we're going to get more specific into Biden's proposal, okay? So we need to understand how markets might respond to reduced supplies of liquefied natural gas there was a report that came out 2 years ago that provided a framework for making this kind of estimation. Basically, the laws of supply and demand say that if supply and demand react to price at all, then taking some amount of these fuels off the market will mean that they're used less, right? So basically, if there's less supply of liquefied natural gas, then it's going to be used less because the price is going to be higher. And at the margins, you're going to reduce some of that liquefied natural gas use. Now, it depends how responsive the kind of market and the specific fuel is to demand or to price to see how effective a policy like this would actually be. Now, what studies so far have found about natural gas is that it actually is quite responsive to price. So to understand that, we have to figure out what is natural gas used for. And while natural gas is used for generating electricity, it's also largely used for home heating. People don't tend to change their electricity use that much. based on their electric bill, right? I mean, obviously, maybe they'll pay a little bit more attention to turning off their lights, but people are trying to turn off their lights anyways. People are already trying not to use excess electricity. However, for heating your home, consumers do have their hand more on a dial for that, right? Like it makes a difference to your heating bill to heat your house at 71 degrees versus heating it at 65 degrees, right? So they can actually control that more. And we have an example of a paper that looked at how responsive prices in Germany were after the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Perfect.
Right? It's a perfect example where natural gas flows to Germany were cut off because they didn't want to fund Russia's war effort. And looking at how much the price spikes that resulted from that lack of supply was and how much that reduced consumption, we saw that by September 2022, after, remember, the war started in February 2022, consumption was reduced by 28%.
Wow.
Right? So that's big. That's really significant.
So there was a restriction in supply, and so then the consumption of it also declined.
Yes, the restriction of supply drove up prices, which led to lower consumption.
Do we know energy usage in total?
Energy usage stayed pretty flat.
Okay.
Or no. I lied. Energy usage did go down some, but less.
Gotcha.
There was some replacement. That's something that when we look at these markets generally, you do have to think about. So if you take some off the market, it's going to drive prices down, but it can always be replaced from somewhere else. So for example, right, if when Russian natural gas went offline, Germany started importing a lot of natural gas from the US.
Yes.
Now that natural gas was more expensive because it had to be shipped across the Atlantic to get there rather than being piped in. But they were still able to maintain their energy usage up to a relatively equal degree. So that concept of like restricting supply from one place, but then having it come from another place is called market leakage. So you have the leakage of natural gas coming from the US into Germany as an example. Now, where this becomes more complicated is when you introduce these other forms of energy or these other sources of energy, and you compare their emissions with natural gas. Natural gas emits the least amount of carbon dioxide of natural gas, oil, and coal. Okay, It goes coal generates the most when it's burned, or coal emits the most, then oil, then natural gas. So the biggest fear, the most prominent fear with a proposal to restrict natural gas production is, are these countries just going to switch to coal? Well, it's complicated.
Well, I'll tell you this. My initial reaction was I heard the news that Joe Biden was restricting liquefied natural gas shipments over to Germany. My first reaction was, why would he do that? That's just going to make them use coal more.
Exactly.
So that's my priors. That's what I initially thought when I read that headline and I read that article.
Yes. And so I want to first look at the premise, because there's actually been some new research coming out about how much different the effects of natural gas or coal really are on the environment. We know that the rates of CO2 from burning them are that coal emits about double the CO2 as natural gas. But something that can augment this understanding is looking at the amount of methane leakage that happens during coal or natural gas production when this happens. So I'm not exactly sure this matters that much for the Biden policy, because I think this natural gas is going to be extracted either way. But if we're generally talking about restricting extraction or production of coal versus natural gas, a study from last year found that methane leakage rates of like 5 to 8% at natural gas extraction points make natural gas life cycle emissions, the emissions of that whole process of extracting all the way through burning, equal to or less than that of coal. So just on the face of this premise that, natural gas is going to drive to more coal use, we don't even know if that's worse for the environment. So I just want to point that out.
Did you say less than or equal to, or less than or greater?
Less than or equal to. So
I'm sorry.
greater than, natural gas emissions
Yeah.
life cycle can be greater than or equal to coal.
Greater than or equal, not less than or equal. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for getting into
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Okay.
So it can be as bad
So
as
that's
coal.
with a 5 to 8% methane leakage in the production process of natural gas.
Yeah.
Right,
And
so that's when the extraction, you're getting it out of the ground through fracking or something.
Exactly.
That methane leakage, got it.
exactly. And
And that's something that hasn't been regulated in the United States for a long time until recently.
exactly.
It just started getting regulated.
And they just had an agreement at COP28 to do it in more countries.
Yes.
So that is important. But right now, like satellite imagery that we get or measurements from satellite imagery shows there's methane leakage at these natural gas extraction facilities that range from 0.2% all the way up to like 66%.
Whoa.
So yeah, there are plenty of these places that do seem to have worse life cycle emissions than these coal mines. Putting that off the table, then we want to talk about specifically, okay, so let's say natural gas does, let's say it's a natural gas facility that does create less emissions than coal. It's not, we need to look at this at a more specific perspective, because I don't think that Germany or France or Spain or any of these European countries, I don't think they're really at risk of burning that much more coal. The US and Germany have dropped their coal usage to less than 10% of global coal production. They have, or coal consumption. They have made a concerted effort to phase out coal. They've been removing it from the infrastructure. And I think that they're on this path such that removing coal or a natural gas, removing a fossil fuel source from the economy from one of the US or the EU is more likely to push them in the direction of ramping up their efforts to create green energy infrastructure.
Yeah.
I think they're more on that side already.
Okay.
On the other hand, China and India account for 70% of the world's coal production. They have such massive economies that even though there have been huge pushes to develop clean energy infrastructure in China and India, India specifically is still too poor to even provide electricity to everyone. So it needs to invest in coal to just allow people to have the basic need that is power.
Yes.
Right? So India, so if you look at these contracts of where are these natural gas terminals going to be shipping to, and you're taking coal off the market for contracts that are going to China or to India, then I think we are going to look at more coal consumption, and that could be a problem. So it's tough because you want to be able to target it. You want to be able to send natural gas to the places that need it to wean off coal, and you want it to be able to not go to Europe where, say, it'll just subsidize cheaper gas burning for much longer than it has to, while they could be switching to solar, to wind, to nuclear, right?
Sure.
But that's not how it works. We don't work in a world market where we can explicitly agree where these things are sent. Most of the buyers on these new contracts are the massive oil producers, natural gas producers that already exist, that are just looking to buy up all of our natural gas and flip it on the market. Like Shell, Chevron, BP, Exxon, those are the biggest buyers of the natural gas we're exporting. And even if we did send it directly to China and India, they can flip it too.
Right.
We can't trust that it's going to do exactly what we want it to do. We just do operate in more or less an open market in the world. So when it comes down to it, like I found it hard to come to a real clear opinion on this. I think that I like Biden's, I don't know what my perfect policy is, which is why I like Biden's policy of saying, okay, what we're doing right now is we're just not going to increase our export capacity for now. We're going to pause our export capacity. We're going to see what happens in the next 9 months, see what happens to global markets, see how coal generation changes or whether it does it all. We're going to see what direction countries go in as far as developing their green energy infrastructure.
Yeah.
And we're not going to flood the market with more cheap gas that will be burned and emit more carbon. This is especially important from a perspective of the U.S. already being the biggest LNG exporter in the world.
Right.
And these terminals that have been paused now, they represent a doubling of our capacity. We are the biggest in the world, and these would double our capacity. And these terminals, these aren't built to operate for 5 years and be done, right? If we give them the green light and they start exporting now, we're giving them decades of runway. It's really, really hard to rein them in past this. So this is like the last defense we have against this gas being extracted and burned.
Yeah.
Right. So when you think about it that way, and you think about the limited, very limited carbon budget that we kind of have left over that we can burn before hitting tipping points in climate change, like the 1.5 degrees Celsius, I think this is a good and probably necessary step, even with the risk of greater coal consumption elsewhere.
I think you're right. You haven't shown me any evidence to think that coal consumption will go up because of this. And you've also given me some inclination to think like maybe coal consumption isn't necessarily that much better than natural gas.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. Now, I mean, I take issue with that because a lot of the carbon emission reduction coming from the United States has been because of the move away from coal to natural gas.
Yes.
Right? A lot of our carbon reduction since the 70s or since 2005 is because of that transition.
Yes, but that hasn't really been taking into account this methane leakage. We haven't been looking at that. Because you're right about carbon, but methane is a more powerful natural.
No, I know that, but are methane emissions have been increasing? I don't know. I don't know that.
No, that's the thing. Yeah, I don't know either.
Okay.
But the calculations
about
the carbon emissions haven't been taking that into account.
I gotcha.
So we're just not sure. And again, I don't want to definitively claim, I don't think anyone should definitively claim that we're going to not increase coal emissions.
Right.
I think China and India totally could see that with less of this natural gas in the market. But we've talked about this before. Maybe we're just at the point where we need to make gambles.
Yeah,
right?
we should just throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. And I agree with that mindset for sure.
So I don't know. I think it's interesting. One thing I will say, we're doing this with natural gas. I would hope that we do this with coal.
Yeah, why haven't we done it with coal yet?
Right?
That's what confuses me. I don't understand why we haven't done it with coal, but we're doing it for liquefied natural gas.
Yeah, I think that's the clear thing. I also think we should do it with oil because oil, I think, might even be more responsive as far as demand to price.
Yeah, it is. It's one of the most. It's one of the most.
Yes,
responsive to prices.
Exactly. So like that's going to spur greater adoption, faster adoption of EVs.
Mm-hmm.
So natural gas is, again, it's the smallest emitter, right? So it doesn't make so much sense to me that it is the number one target for the Biden administration, except for the angle that I haven't mentioned yet, that isn't the climate change angle, and that is stability of gas prices
at home. Yes,
exactly.
If in an election year, if he puts less gas out on the international market, keeps it more in house, gas prices at home will be cheaper, inflation will be stayed down, right?
Yep.
And so his election chances might get higher because people are looking at their pocketbook and see that sub 2% inflation number. And
well, you talk about election chances, which is true, but I also just think about it as far as like it's good for people.
Yeah, it's just good for people.
It's
here
good
in the
for
United
people
States.
here. Yeah, exactly. Especially because international markets have to drive up the price when you have situations like like the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yep.
Right. We were not as vulnerable to that shock, but our natural gas prices are still going to be affected by that shock if we freely allow our natural gas to be exported into the international market.
I agree.
So yeah, it's an interesting multifaceted issue, right? Like there's not a clear answer besides, to me, do this for coal, do this for oil.
Do this for coal, please.
Yeah,
please.
Definitely.
And oil.
Mm-hmm. All right.
I'm done.
Cool.
Thanks, guys.
Goodbye, people.